We're live. Okay, welcome everyone to the IHR Digital History Seminar taking place this evening at the UCL, where we have a panel discussion considering digital history in the classroom. Welcome everyone here live and those of you following online on YouTube. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to three excellent and going to be very interesting panelists. Dr. Claire Rowland, Associate Professor of Roman History and Numismatics. I didn't pronounce that correctly, but Claire may indicate that. From the University of Warwick, Department of Classics and Ancient History, who is a research on the potential of numismatic evidence for broader historical and archaeological questions, thinking of coinage as a medium for negotiations and power. And she's running a current project on token communities in the ancient world and thinking about how tokens fit into the ancient world society, which is an EU Research Council funded project. She's also won an award for teaching excellence at the University of Warwick and has published numerous books, chapters, and articles, including From Caesar to Augustus, Using Coins as Sources, from CUP in 2019.
Yes.
Under Divine Auspices, Divine Ideology, and the Visualization of Imperial Power in the Severn period from CUP from 2013. But she's not going to talk to us directly about the classical world and coins, however interesting that is, in which case I'd suggest you to buy her books and look at her numerous articles. She's going to talk to us about something quite different than that. Something I believe you haven't published on yet.
No.
And may very well do in due course, which is using the digital in the classroom. And particularly two aspects of that: digital storytelling, and a way, which is a seminar activity. Hi, Digital History Seminar, come on in.
You found us.
You almost need like an interactive map.
Unfortunately, that is all too true, yes. Those of you following online, just be thankful you're in the comfort of your own home. Everyone else has to negotiate UCL's interesting room arrangements. So back to Claire and digital storytelling in the classroom, which is part of an undergraduate module on the Hellenistic world, a compulsory module where she gets them to do both seminar activities and for an assessment, which is one of the things she's going to talk to us in considerable detail, in a few minutes. And secondly, also in relationship to Wikipedia and female biographies as an exercise for first-year seminar. And Claire will begin the talk in a few minutes, but I'll just introduce the other two speakers. Following on from Claire, we're going to have Dr. Rob Houghton, who's a senior lecturer in early medieval European history at the University of Winchester, where he's been since 2015. His doctoral research was on representations of collective action in Italian communes, pro-communes. Also interested in the investiture controversy. And he also has research interest in representations of the Middle Ages in modern games and gaming. He's been involved in that in a direct fashion for Paradox Interactive, for their Crusader Kings game, and he's also an editor on the Public Medievalist website. And he teaches a module on the Middle Ages in computer games. He's published numerous articles and book chapters on medieval history and on gaming, and notably, Where Did You Learn That? The Self-Perceived Educational Impact of Historical Computer Games for undergraduates, and World Rules and Play, Digital Games as Historical Research Tools. And upcoming, amongst a number of edited books, is Crusader Kings 2, Misrepresentations of Crusaders in Grand Strategy Games. And he's going to be very much introducing to us and talking to us about his experiences of teaching gaming and using gaming to teaching medieval history. And finally is Dr. James Baker, senior lecturer in digital history and archives at the University of Sussex, where he's a member of the Sussex Humanities Lab and the Department of History. In many ways, for those of you who are regular attendees of the seminar, you should need no introduction because he's one of our fellow conveners. And is quite prominent in the field of digital history. And he's got an interest in the digital record. history of knowledge organization, historical interaction with information technologies, and the history of the printed image. He is a member of the Programming Historical Editorial Board, and you can certainly check out his research blog, Cradled in Caricature, for further information. He's published his PhD, The Business of Satirical Prints in Late Modern England, Macmillan 2017, as well as numerous articles and chapters, not least relating to the programming historian, one of the things that he's going to talk about in a few minutes. And last but not least, it certainly needs to be mentioned and praise given out for the recent award from the Royal Historical Society for his work alongside Dr. Sharon Webb in incorporating digital history into undergraduate teaching. And he will be our third speaker. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce the panel to you. And now let me end and let the experts begin and hopefully set us off with some interesting ideas, followed by some interesting discussion. They'll each talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion and maybe even debate. So I'm going to now pass over to Claire Owen. Over to you.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. Right, so I have to direct someone to change my slides for me. So yes, what I'm going to talk about today is essentially, because I only was given 10 or 15 minutes, the use of digital storytelling in undergraduate teaching, particularly, for the Hellenistic world, which works in a way which I'll explain in a minute. But I thought it would be good to sort of kick it off with like a digital story that was produced by one of my students a few years ago now, a group, just to give you an idea of the sort of thing that is, and I'm sure you're all quite familiar with it. So if you could click onto YouTube, for those who are online, it may not come through, but you can find the Warwick Classics YouTube channel on YouTube. And we have a whole array of videos on there. And so it was Aristophanes of Byzantium. Yeah.
Aristophanes of Byzantium was one of the Library of Alexandria's most prolific scholars. By following his life, we can see this ancient institution at its enlightened best and its avaricious worst. Aristophanes moved to Alexandria while young, where he associated with scholars Zenodotus and Callimachus. One tradition states that he first achieved renown at a literary contest as one of 7 judges. 6 declared the crowd's favourite performer the winner. Aristophanes disagreed, using his encyclopedic knowledge of Greek literature to prove that all the works were plagiarised, save the one which the crowd had applauded the least. Consequently, the honest man was victorious, and Aristophanes became head librarian. Aristophanes was credited with the invention of basic punctuation and the first system of Greek accents. In his privileged position, he had access to a vast collection, and the Ptolemies went to great lengths to secure more texts. Their scribes impounded any ship-bound scrolls that arrived at Alexandria, made copies that kept the originals. Despite enjoying a life of considerable luxury, Aristophanes eventually fell foul of Ptolemy IV's vindictive nature. In his 70s, Aristophanes was detained for attempting to defect to the Library of Pergamon, which was owned by the Attalid dynasty, the Ptolemies' arch rivals. On release, in poor health, he died of strangury, an excruciating bladder disease. Many of the stories concerning Aristophanes are hard to verify. The fame of the Alexandrian institution has eclipsed his reputation. He lived in a gilded cage, as much the property of the library as the library was of its Ptolemaic owners. Scholars today differ over the plight of their Alexandrian counterparts. They've been compared both to members of a government think tank and to soldiers in a Spartan barracks. Based on the life of Aristophanes of Byzantium, however, we glimpse an erudite Hellenistic elite who lived the life of Damocles, surrounded by scrolls with the Ptolemaic swords suspended permanently above their heads. If you'd like to know more about ancient scholars and their works, check out these books.
All right, so yeah, if we can go back to the PowerPoint. Essentially, yeah, what I get students to do, this is a second year undergraduate module, and it is a compulsory module for all our students, which does sort of change the nature of doing digital history, I think. So if we can go one more along. And what I get them to do in seminars is create digital stories. And this is, oh, I think we've got some video playing in the background. Oh, Michael Scott on Greek religion. Oh, no. Yeah, perfect. And so basically what the medium is based on the Center for Digital Storytelling, which is an online center, which was created in essence more for work in social work or with charities. And the point of the point of digital storytelling is to empower people who may not have technical digital skills in sort of the higher sense. I include myself among them. My digital skills are not all that. But to empower them to be able to tell stories and to communicate in a way that doesn't actually require a lot of technical know-how. And I was originally trained in it by the Warwick Impact team, because they were hoping this was going to be used for the ref and we would all create wondrous impact and communicate our research. And I sat in the seminar and I thought, well, actually, yeah, I can see I would work in research, but actually I can see where it would actually work even better. And what characterizes a digital story is it's not like a BBC epic movie production. It's something that's personal and authentic, controlled by the storyteller. And it's really a short video, 2 to 3 minutes, with a recorded voiceover, still images, so just JPEG images, and you can enhance it with subtle special effects. And there's a whole website dedicated to digital storytelling. And there's a few other communities online. There's a Facebook group. There's a few other things where people can sort of exchange best practice and for different types of group. But it is mainly used in social work. But when I sat in this seminar, I thought, actually, I can see that this can be put to teaching. If we go to the next slide. So essentially, because what the creating of a digital story is essentially the same as the historical inquiry process. And this comes from a seminar I ran with someone in Australia for high school teachers teaching it in history. It's the same sort of idea. You come up with an idea, what's the story you want to tell? You need to sort of go and research it, find the sources, find the images. You need to write what you're going to say, figure out, story on the planet, edit what you're going to say, and then sort of put it all together and reflect. And it's sort of very similar process that you would find for a historian. If we can go to the next slide. The reasons I decided to implement it is because I had just been put in charge of this core second year module, the Hellenistic World, which, if you don't know that much about ancient history, this is basically Alexander the Great and the chaos that comes afterwards. And I had taught it for 1 year already. And the thing about the Hellenistic world is it's filled with fantastic stories. I mean, Alexander the Great inspires all sorts of stories, and his various sort of fictional novels in antiquity up through the Middle Ages were written about him, the Alexander romances, including things like Alexander going down to the ocean in the bottom of a glass barrel. At some point, he goes up into space on the back of a griffin holding some meat in front. And there are sort of less obvious stories as well, but which are stories. And the first time I taught this module, I sort of explained the point that there was a lot of stories that we need to be careful as historians. And I got a lot of essays that were like, oh, and so-and-so says that Alexander went up into space. Of course, we can't trust this. But it does show, and then sort of interpreting it. And they were struggling with how to deal with this type of material where it is all stories. I thought if we can begin to think about storytelling and what the purpose of a story is, because actually you can use them in history, as I try to explain to my students. There is a meaning behind the story. So the meaning behind the story of Alexander going up into space is that it means there is a limit to human ambition, and you shouldn't go somewhere further than where humans are meant to go. And the gods sent Alexander back down to Earth, and it's like, enough. That's the way you sort of need to use it. So I use it with the students. We have the first lecture we have in the module is me talking about stories and why I tell stories, to communicate a point, to find our place in the world, to understand why things are the way they are, And in this period of history, because the whole world essentially got turned upside down and completely new political power structures were instituted, there are a lot of stories and explanations as to why things are the way they are. And I thought by doing this, talking about stories, the students would hopefully have a better understanding of the texts they were reading, Alexander's Wild Activities and various other activities, various other stories as well. I was also trying to overcome the horrors of the silent seminar. It's so painful to sit in a seminar and no one talks. And I was just thinking, like, how can the digital sort of overcome that? And since it was the core module, I think the first time I ran this in the module, I might have had 90 students, and I had no teaching assistants. And so I thought also by holding one enormous 2-hour seminar, I can have them all at once. Instead of running the same seminar sort of 5 times by myself, I thought, well, this will save myself time, and we'll try to go ahead with it. The other thing that appealed to me in terms of the digital storytelling in terms of history is that it really is this authentic voice from below, and histories that aren't traditionally sort of told. The students can engage with these sorts of ideas, and every year they struggle when they tell stories of women, or even Aristophanes of Byzantium. They come up to me like, but there's no images. How can I tell this story when there's no picture of this person? I'm like, well, you have to get creative. And so there's this consistent struggle, and the students begin to realize like what figures and what events have like images, so to speak, and which ones are missing this type of thing. And that sort of fits into a philosophy. We talk about sort of histories from below, and the sorts of things that should go on in museums in terms of exhibitions and things like that. And I sort of helped to students about Orhan Pamuk and the Museum of Innocence, and his idea that, you know, we need, instead of epics, novels and stories, instead of histories and persons, instead of nations, and this type of history from below. It does also have the additional transferable skills that universities like to go on about. This was not my intention when I went down this path, but, you know, if you need to sell it. So the students, because I tell the students it will go up online on our YouTube channel, all the images have to be copyright free, the music and sound effects have to be copyright free. And so we go through a lot of explanations about copyright and what images can and can't be used. Yes. So yeah, and because it's a core module, it's interesting in a sense because it's not self-selecting. So other digital history things I've taught has been self-selecting in essence. It's like people have chosen it because they like the digital or they're confident with it. Whereas this, everyone is in there together. And I mean, the first year I ran this, I remember sitting in the computer lab and it was saying to me, I did classics because I don't do computers. And I was like, wow, we all do computers. And what's been fascinating actually, like do the computers. I mean, but it was forced, and it was the. But what's been fascinating is that was the first year I ran it, when even my colleagues were like, "What is she doing in that module?" But within 5 years, it's completely transformed, and they all know it's coming, and they all know it's a part of what this degree is, and so it's the translation has been very interesting. But it does mean, because it's core, that's why I purposely leave it very simple. I want everyone to sort of have a sense of achievement at the end that they've managed to do it. And so I essentially assign them into groups that they can choose themselves. So the way it runs at the moment is in the first term, we have 2 2-hour seminars, and as a group, they create a story. And in the second term, they have the option of submitting it in place of an essay. Though if they feel uncomfortable, they can still submit the essay. And it's merely because it's core that we couldn't make it we thought, we'll leave it as a choice. I don't think we're allowed to do that at work anymore, but just going to stay on the down low. The idea of going to find their own topic, like what story they want to talk about, is also meant to sort of foster a sense of independence that will sort of help them in their dissertations in the third year, like go and find a topic. So if we can move on. So the practicalities, the way it works is, we have 2 2-hour seminars, and as I say, they're all in together. And for having had the lecture on the storytelling, and we look at some really fun stories from antiquity, and they then go, and I give them various resources they can go and look at for more stories. They come as a group with their written story written down no more than 350 words, which is nice and challenging for them, actually. And I was like, trust me, for every word you are more, it's going to increase the number of pictures you need. The longer the video, it's going to just, exponentially create more work for you. And then I get the students to form story circles where the groups break up and they all sit around in a circle and read out the stories and get feedback from their peers. This teaches them the joy of editing. And that's how I edit my work. I read it aloud. I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound right. And as they're reading it aloud, most groups will be like, oh, actually, this is really long. Yeah, okay, no, we have to go back and edit it. And then in that seminar, they have the option of going and recording their story if they like, or they can record it afterwards. And so they have a series of weeks before the next seminar where they have to record the voiceover. And it's up to them how they want to do that. I have a setup in my office that they can just come and use. It's also ready to go for them. And most of them do just book in and come and use that. It would be, I sort of say, but you think about like ambient noise. You could go to a museum, you could go to the lake, and they all just end up in my office. Fine. And the idea of getting them to record their voice too is meant to sort of build confidence in this area. So in our third year, we have a compulsory non-assessed presentation, but it causes nervous breakdowns every year. So I thought this way you get a little bit of practice before the big verbal, presentation. And I emphasize to the students like the first sentence, the last sentence. And so the software we use is Audacity, which is free, and we use WeVideo, which is also free and online, so that way students can log in from wherever they are, and they don't have to have a set format or set sort of computer to be able to run the software. And currently we run an educational license with WeVideo, which is pretty cheap. It's like $200 or something a year, which means I can log in and see all their work if they're having a problem. They're like, oh, I just don't know how to finish it. And I log in and I look, I'm like, you press the button, finish. So these sorts of things, they get to the end and so they're like, we don't know what to do next. And so that's just a setup of basically what the room looks like. We have in work this very wonderful flexible teaching space that you can book and request it to be set up however you like. You're like, I want a party, I would like to have bathtubs, or I don't know. I set up saying I want computers, laptops, and I need group workspace. So if we move on to the next one. So as seminar work, encourage them to finish this seminar work. I have annually a festival of digital storytelling called the Hellies, of which there is a prize. And then very people from the department are invited to come. And normally the students who won the previous year come back and are the celebrity judges for the next year. And it's a nice sort of social occasion for the department. And traditionally we hold this close to exams, which then also means it can hopefully act as a form of sort of revision where people are like, oh yeah. So if we move on, so sort of talk about the impact and the challenges of it. So it is now a form of assessment, but I did run this about 3 years before it was agreed that this could become a form of assessment. And we basically modeled the judging or the marking criteria off our existing essay marking criteria. The students actually have come to really enjoy it, and we've got a lot of spin-offs from it. So the students this year, after we ran the audio recording seminar, have decided they want to run their own podcast. They're like, I didn't realize you had a microphone and a computer, and now we know how to use video, audio recording software. So separate order coming to a podcast near you. Students are also using the software to create trailers or sort of advertising for other events like toga parties, and like we run a play every year. And so actually, and I have to say that the sophistication of the trailers has increased substantially since they started doing this. And also I think, and I come back in their third year when they're about to graduate and be like, those seminars you had last year that you all hated me for, the power of storytelling, friends, to say like you can actually use it in job interviews, tell the story, make sure it's a good story. Why are you good at this? And for funding, I mean, my own storytelling skills have become substantially better. I'm pretty sure that's why I got the ERC funding. I was like, storytelling. I'm going to go tell them a story. There's going to be those sexy images behind. And because some of our students go into museum work and things like that, it's sort of a good skill for them as well. I will say a lot of student skills are greater than mine. And when students come to the classroom and they look at horror, it's a clunky software I've got going. And I was like, by all means, feel free to use your own software, but you have to train your group. And so quite a few of them are much happier being released from my clunky software. The surprising challenge of this is actually not really the digital, but how to teach the students to work in groups, which took me by surprise the first time. And yeah, so I actually do have to explain to them how to work in groups. Like, don't all sit there while one person searches for images, because that's what they were doing, I realized. And every year, 1 or 2 groups just collapse. And I say, well, now it's good experience, group work. The software I have to renew every year, and it's a constant battle with paperwork and funds. The fact that I'm using my office as a recording studio is not ideal. It would be nice to have some place for them to go. And the other point is I'm actually the only one in the department who runs it. So even though I am on research leave, I'm still teaching this because there's no one to take it over. And I had hoped colleagues would have, having sat in on many of the seminars, done it themselves, but they haven't yet. So I am still running this. Yeah, and I can talk more about that in the discussion. If we go to the next slide. Just to finish, I'm also teaching a first year Introduction to Roman History module. And in that now I run, again, 2-hour seminars where I get the students to add to women's biographies on Wikipedia, which I ran for the first time this year. And it's really for first years to get them to think about Wikipedia more critically as what is and isn't on there. And it links to what we're doing in the module, like what history is written, what history isn't written, what is history and what forms does it take. And it's linked to a wider initiative that the Women's Classical Committee is running to sort of bring women out on Wikipedia. So it also gives the idea that you're already historians, independents, go forward, contribute to the discipline. And yeah, we do a lot of prosopography in that module, so it sort of links into the broader themes. Yeah, having run it, what was interesting the first time I've run this is that they all got bogged down in finding photos of academics, which I'm not going to do. I'll be like, no, they're like, why can't I use this photo? And so then I explained again, copyright to them, which will make my life much easier next year, I think, because they'll already know. But I can speak about this in more detail if anyone's interested in that. But the students felt like a sense of achievement and pride at the end, even though they'd only added like 3 lines or something. We did existing biographies, adding to existing biographies. Next week, we'll do creating new biographies as the next step. Yeah, so I'll leave it there and pass on to the next person. Oh, thank you.
And now we're going to move on to Dr. Robert Houghton, digital gaming in the classroom.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richard. Thanks to all the co-conveners, everyone over here, everyone out there. Yeah, I don't know. This is going to be a very shallow overview of what I've been doing with digital gaming in the classroom, and hopefully we can pick apart some bits and pieces that are of interest. I also have a ridiculous number of slides, for which I apologise. So, when we talk about computer games, well, when we hear about computer games, it's often presented as a childish pastime. It's just something that's silly, something that's for kids, or alternatively as a murder simulator, which is a weird dichotomy. But as I'm sure everyone's aware, that games can be serious. Games can deal with important political, social, philosophical issues. They can tell stories in new and interesting, innovative ways. And of course, games can be used. Sorry, I'll skip past 2 slides. Sorry, I forgot to be instructing. I'm tabbing things here, and it's not helpful. It's my fault. Sorry. And of course, games can also be used as educational tools, and that's basically what I'm talking about. And even if we're not using games as educational tools, we need to be aware of the impact they're having on our students. If you've got a class of more than about 6 students, I reckon at least one of them will have been heavily influenced by computer games in some way, shape or form. There's some research being done on this, partly by myself, but more especially by Dr. Sian Beavers in her doctoral dissertation completed last year. Definitely get in touch with her if you're interested in a very deep dive into some statistics. It's really well done. So what I'm talking about today is digital gaming in the classroom. I'll then go on and talk about some of the key limitations, which there's a substantial overlap with what Claire's been talking about in terms of practicalities, costs, and so forth. And then finally, I'm going to very briefly talk about the project I'm running down at the University of Winchester, making better games for history, teaching, and research. So, digital games in the classroom. Again, cheers, thank you. So, I use games in various methods within the classroom, and I'll start off with using them to teach around history. So it's something that's very useful for getting students to understand popular history. It can be a way of getting them to think about how different media formats present history differently, and possibly more importantly, how popular history, while it uses a lot of the same resources as academic history, ultimately comes up with some very different outputs. Building on from that, this can help students to think about what they can achieve with a history degree, what sort of jobs they can get out of it. And games can also be very useful for teaching practical historical skills and historiographical skills. This is something I've not actually used, but it's something I'm incredibly excited about. Dr. Manuel Martinez, this is James's colleague, down at the University of Sussex, has recently released this Time Historians. This is his doctoral project. I implore everybody to take a look at this because you can play it on the browser. Basically, it's a game for up to 4 people. You take on the role of a historian and you decide which elements, which historical items, which historical pieces of evidence you're going to privilege and how you're going to interpret them. And then as a group, you construct a historical narrative. It's really innovative. It's really a really great tool, I think, for teaching students how to engage with the past and with historiography. This is all great, but it's not really what I'm interested in. So I'm much more concerned with how we can use games to represent history and how we can use games to learn about history. And I do this in several ways, mainly through my module, The Middle Ages in Modern Games. So first of all, in various modules, I've used games as a way of introducing a period, a theme, or a region. So a lot of my teaching, a lot of my research is based on continental Europe in the 10th and the 11th centuries. The vast majority of my students have relatively little idea about the political state of the world, of Europe at that time, the religious conditions, the economic conditions. What I've done in a number of classes is used first of all, the demo version, but now the free-to-play version of Crusader Kings 2. It's a game by Paradox Interactive, based up in Sweden, which goes into a ridiculous amount of depth about the various political, religious, economic, warfare aspects of the Middle Ages. A lot of the time, I don't even have the students play the game. They just load it up and they explore the map. They explore the various different figures presented within the game. And from that, they get an introduction, they get an idea of what medieval Europe looked like. So it's great from an introductory point of view. I've done something similar as well, or have tried something similar, using the first 2 Assassin's Creed games as an introduction to the cities of the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, and also for the cities of Renaissance Italy. This is a bit more of a struggle. This is a bit more difficult to facilitate because there's no easy way to explore the cities without getting fairly far into the game. It's an activity that tends to work better when I send students away to do this outside the classroom. So this is great. Games can be a really good way of introducing students to the past. It could be a great way of getting them interested in the past. But this is pretty basic. I mean, this is good for maybe the first week of a course. After that, what are you going to do with the games? And I think there's a lot more that we can do with games. And I think one of the most interesting things is using games to approach historical arguments. Essentially, a game is a set of rules. It's a set of mechanics. It's how the game world is constructed, and these rules form an argument about the nature of that world. So if you're playing a historical game, if you're playing something like one of the games from the Civilization series, these rules are based on historical arguments, or at least they make historical arguments. And in this case of civilization, there's a lot to unpack here, but for example, it's got a lot to do with ecological history, environmental history rather. So one of the key aspects of the game is that low or flatlands, plains, grasslands and so forth produce more food than mountains and hills. But mountains and hills produce more minerals, more resources. And what this means is when you play the game, you'll find that cities that are built within flatlands surrounded by grasslands in particular will tend to grow very fast, while cities built in mountains and around hills will tend to be, or have the potential to become industrial powerhouses. It's a fairly basic argument, but it's right there, and the students have to engage with it as they play. If they want to progress within the game, they have to learn the argument presented by the game. This is something Jeremiah McCall has been talking about quite a lot over the best part of a decade now. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that we can interrogate these arguments through play. So if you end up with a completely ahistorical result, if, for example, Charlemagne not only conquers France, Germany, northern Italy, the Low Countries and so forth, but conquers the entirety of the known world, if this is something that happens on a regular basis, it raises some questions about the rules, about the mechanics of the game, and by extension about the arguments that they make. It suggests that we need to go back to these rules, back to these arguments, and consider how they could be improved, how they could become more nuanced to better explain this period of history, these events. So this is the stuff that I've been doing within my class, Middle Ages in computer games. It's basically every week we have a different theme. So we'll have violence one week, we'll have race in the Middle Ages in another, gender, politics, various other bits and pieces. And each week the students will go away, they'll play a game, they'll discuss the arguments that are put forward by that game. This is great. This is relatively advanced. It's almost university level thinking, analysis and so forth. It's a bit more of a step forward than just using games to introduce the past. What I really want to do though is to take this a step further. And this is something that Key and Graham and a number of other historians have been trying, including Mike Cosgrove over in the University of Cork. The next step, as I see this, is using user modifications, changes made to the games by players as a way of conducting historical debate. So the idea behind this, well, if the rules of a game represent a historical argument constructed by the game's designers, if the players, if the students can get to grips with those rules and can change those rules, then by extension, they're changing the arguments. In effect, they're conducting a form of historical debate. And if that's grounded in sufficient research, attached to the historiography, to the primary sources, this could be a valid form of scholarly research. I should emphasise this is obviously very different from your standard essays, monographs, articles, and so forth, but I don't think that means that it's not useful. I don't think that it means that it's not valid. Brilliant. So that's what I want to do. There are, of course, several problems with this approach. So, of course, with many of these, with almost all of the games that I've talked about so far, they're commercial. They're designed primarily for entertainment purposes. So a lot of them are branded as being historically accurate, having consultants who are historians attached to them. But ultimately, they're a commercial product. That's not that much of a problem in the bigger picture. I think this is more an issue of how the media is being used rather than the nature of the media. So of course these games have been designed with entertainment in mind, so it's creating problems using them as academic tools. To be fair, that's the same argument as saying, well, Dan Brown is popular history, so let's reject literature as a historical format. So there's a few other issues that I'd like to talk about briefly and then consider how they could be overcome. So first of all, there's the problem of cost. Games can be incredibly expensive, especially if you need to buy multiple copies or multiple licenses for a class of 20, 30 students, or potentially even more. Beyond that is the hardware necessary to play these games. This isn't something, there are various ways you can get around this. You can use browser-based games, you can use more simple games, but ultimately this is something that needs to be addressed, and I appreciate a lot of humanities and social sciences departments don't have money to throw around at computers in this way. A further issue is one of skill set. So we've had this, as Claire said, a number of students will come to the class saying, well, I did history to get away from programming. I don't want to do computing. This is a bit trickier to overcome. Key and Graham get around it by combining history classes with game design classes. So you get teams composed of folks studying both of these degrees. This is brilliant. However, it relies on having a game design degree running in the university, and it also relies on interdepartmental cooperation, and indeed having institutions who are willing to allow this to happen. So another big issue there. And finally, there's an issue of transparency. So as I've said, games are massive sets of rules, but they tend not to be very good at telling the player what all these rules are. They tend not to be very good at presenting mechanics as is. So one of the big examples of this are games that rely on percentage chances to succeed. So I don't know if you're given a 97% chance to hit an opponent and you miss, then you better hit the next time, or you're going to feel really hard done by. It's things like that. It's games lie to you all the time. So, how can we overcome these? Ultimately, there are various solutions. There's a lot of them involve working the long term, so working more closely across institutions, across disciplines, securing relevant funding, figuring out ways to do this on a tight budget. In the shorter term, though, I propose that we cheat. I propose that we use physical games as a way of approaching this. So this circumvents a lot of the big issues here. So, for example, it's considerably cheaper to create a prototype. You don't need the same sorts of in-depth coding, programming skills, digital humanities skills, which I appreciate is rather taking away from the point of this seminar. It's something that's much more accessible for both students and for lecturers, for people who are running these courses. And beyond that, physical games have to be transparent. You have to be able to express all of the rules to the players, because they're the ones who will be carrying out the calculations. They're the ones who will be deciding how the rules are interpreted, what the impact of their actions are. And that's what I'm doing down at Winchester. I really ought to have thought about the title of this better, but we'll go with Play in the Past, because the rest is a bit of a mouthful. This project is about making board games, and making them to present historical arguments, but setting them up so that they can be easily modified by students, so they can present counter-arguments, so we can conduct debate through games. It's basically a first step towards a project moving back towards digital humanities, and hopefully working in concert with the digital games department down at Winchester. Not managed to get it to work so far for various reasons, no one's fault. But the current prototype I'm working with is the Investiture Contest. This is the conflict in northern Italy from the end of the 11th century into the start of the 12th century. I've been using this in a couple of classes at master's level and at undergrad level. Basically, it's a very simple game. The rules will fit on one side of A4. Students play as one of a number of key figures, and they they try to exert their influence over this area of northern Italy. Very happy to talk about that in more detail, but the big important element of this for me is that after the students have played through this game once or twice, they modify it. So they've been told the basics behind the Investiture Contest. They've been given this very simple and quite frankly very poor representation of the Investiture Contest within the game, and they've been told to make it better. They've been told to stomp all over my design. And it's been working quite well. Next step, as I say, is to go back to digital gaming in the classroom to try and figure out a way to do this on a budget within a computerized setting. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. And now we'll pass on to our last speaker on the panel, Dr. James Baker.
Okay. Oh, I'm going to do the thing where I'd have to look at myself. So I'm going to turn.
Oh, see, already got better digital skills than us.
There you go. Right. I'm going to be brief because I want to have some discussion afterwards. So 1 hour each week in a lecture theatre at University of Sussex, our first year undergraduate historians are taken on a journey from doing history in the digital age to doing digital history. This isn't about teaching 150 undergraduates to code. They don't want to do that. They didn't come to Sussex to do history to do that. It's really about confronting them with technologies that mediate their access to the past. It's about giving them critical skills to navigate that mediation, and it's about building their confidence to use computational approaches in historical work gradually. So I'm going to, in this short talk about some work I'll be doing with my colleague at Sussex, Dr. Sharon Webb. I'm going through the nuts and bolts, what we've been doing in undergraduate teaching, the whys, the hows, the lessons learned. But I also want to spend some time at the end, and this is why Programming Historian is in the title. Hands up in the room who used or know of Programming Historian. That helps, good. I want to think about the intersections and tensions between this undergraduate teaching around digital history and the Programming Historian, which is a novice-friendly, open access, multilingual and peer-reviewed publication that I think fulfills a kind of different need in building the historian's toolkit. And I guess then I want to think about the different functions that these different types of pedagogy play in our profession. So the basics. So for about the previous 4 years, Sharon Webb and I, with a little help from Tim Hitchcock, have been running the digital skills program as part of the Sussex undergraduate history degree. It's 1 hour a week. It's part of the core modules. It's in year one. It's in a lecture slot, and it's not really assessed. And maybe we want to talk about assessment later. It's kind of indirectly assessed through their normal essays. So we're doing this because our department has a strong focus on reflexive practice and on contemporary history. And so one of our motivations for creating this space was to kind of complement those agendas to help our undergrads be better able to understand what it is to do history now, but also, and this is a kind of bee in my bonnet thing, what it will mean to do history of their own world. Born digital sources, things like that. This module over here is the module run by a head of department that is on post-rave Britain. So we do like super contemporary stuff. So digital sources are going to be important to them as they move into beyond their undergraduate careers, or maybe even during it into the being postgrads, etc. And what we're doing in these sessions is we're moving in a narrative, basically, from this doing history in digital age to doing digital history. And the session plan looks something like this. And I've got an asterisk because it's not actually what's happening this year, but I can come back to that later if anyone wants to ask. This is part of a module called The Early Modern World, and it's a lecture that's part of that module. And the lecture series kind of starts with the kind of traditional styles, skills, things, what is history, reading, writing, etc., referencing, and gradually moves through to think about more sort of digital related things like our interfaces to history, for example. I just want to pick out the intersection of two things here, which is the library search week and the searching week. What we're trying to do here is say, well, our library colleagues give wonderful sessions how to do library search. But we want to pair that with a session that's saying, okay, what is it about the mechanics and implications of subjective tools like Google Search which change how you should do history, or have changed how we all do history? Next one. We then moved them after Christmas in the spring term to this doing digital history thing, how we produce data and how we deal with it. So we're moving them in kind of pairs of sessions from making data through digitizing it to visualizing it. And I want to pick out here the digitization blocks. we have a week that's on theory, so lecture on history digitization, but also sort of some stuff around kind of why things get digitized, why other things don't, into a real practical, which isn't a session that's about how to do digitization. Instead, it demonstrates to students the subjective and power-laden work involved in creating digital surrogates of primary materials. And so they kind of have the theoretical session and then move on to the practical session. That's kind of the scope of it. And we finish with what is digital history, because I hate starting with things that are what is field. So our headline findings after about 4 years are thus. Students really like practical. They keep telling us this in our feedback. But at the same time, we really feel we need to have that framing. We started off trying to do a bit of framing, then practical, didn't work. So we just split them out. Whole sessions that are practical, whole sessions that are more kind of background historical theory stuff. Peer learning really helps mass practical. Lectures mean I can have up to 150 students in a lecture theatre. I'm trying to deal with them for an hour, so practical. So designing exercises where they work together is crucial. Students like learning about history. We have had the feedback, I didn't come here to do history to do digital things, just like Claire has. So it's certainly important to remember that during the course of our work. And so we take primary sources here as a perfect hook. In a given week, the content of these modules, Early Modern World and Making the Modern World, are both broad in geographical and chronological scope. So our task is to ensure that our skills lectures aren't too abstract, aren't too separate from the historical topics they came to Sussex to study. So we spend a lot of time explaining the joins. Having now digitized primary source X, Tim gives us a whole stock of London Illustrated News, which we rip up and let them take pictures of. What does that change about how you'll work with the digital representation of primary source Y? Which doesn't always make the most elegant pedagogy, but we think it's really important to keep reinforcing those joins so they see why we're doing this. Students like learning about historical practice, not how to code. Exercises always have questions in them to discuss, not just tasks to complete. So for example, I give the lecture on interfaces to history, which basically is, how does this historical text present the past to you, and is it kind of shaping your view of the past by how it presents it to you? And we ask them not just to do things, but also in their little groups to ask each other questions like, do you think the graphs and counts you see misrepresent the past, and why? And is this a problem? And what this does is draw on the practice of the session, but also say their knowledge of 16th century witch executions, which they're experts on and not me, because I'm not teaching that part of the module. Students dislike titles to do with maths and stats, so we just got rid of them. Students have hugely varying skill levels, and this is really interesting. So one of the tasks, for example, I asked students to rename the file in which they collated a bunch of primary sources and send that back to me with their surnames as the title of the file. Not all students know how to rename files. That's not their fault, but it's also not my place to teach it. And it actually adds a real interesting sort of conundrum in how you keep it close to history without ending up trying to say, right, this is how you rename a file. Because some people think that's a stupid thing to be teaching a history lecture. Other people think it's fundamental. Handouts are your friend. Make them, print them, walk around with them. And particularly if you work in a lecture dynamic while like we are, it really kind of breaks up the lecture space. And I think relying entirely on the virtual learning environment can be a detriment in these, because it closes people into machines whilst I want them to be talking to people around them. And also be scarce with handouts so they don't all get one. You learn a huge amount about the assumptions students and colleagues make about digital and about skills. I'm going to leave that there and not come back to it. We can talk about it later. And the final one is, it does sink in. In the second year, I get loads of queries from students about Zotero, because we have a reference management session, and not just about how do I do my bibliography, but like, how do I kind of, what's a good way of using it to kind of collate my historical research project? And in the third year, we start seeing students do interesting things that are digital history. So there's a module that Sharon and I run on the history of archiving, part of which is about thinking about traditional ways of archival practice and how they may or may not intersect with how to do archiving now, given the digital world around us. A bunch of students took the code from the Document the Now project and run it to get tweets to find out how they might apply archival practice to the outputs of the Document the Now project. We didn't suggest it to them, they just did it. And that kind of suggests there's a confidence level going through our degree program to do this stuff. Okay, so how does this map onto what we do with the programming history in terms of pedagogy? These kind of outcomes, these learnings that we're getting from undergraduate work. This is a bit of a jolt, but I think it's kind of, I wanted to kind of join these two together to think about, because I work on both these things all the time, and it kind of seems important to me to reflect on what we do and don't do. So students like practical. We do that in spades. Sorry, I'm going to keep asking you to click along. All our lessons are incredibly practical, and there are lots of them. Next one. Peer learning helps. We really don't do that in the programming historian. But I know people do get together, like colleagues at the British Library get together for little hacks around lessons, and I find that quite interesting. Students like learning about history. We certainly do that. Our lessons are framed very much as this is kind of my historical research, and this is how you might go about learning lessons based on what I did. So, for example, if you took Adam Crimble's wonderful lesson on using gravity models and migration and trade, you won't only learn about gravity models, you'll learn a lot about 18th century migratory practices in the British Isles, because that's what Adam cares about. Primaries are a perfect hook. We definitely do that with the programming historian. So, for example, you can mass download stuff from Europeana with our lesson on APIs. And as part of our commitment to writing international audiences, one of the things the program historian is doing is try and diversify the kinds of primary sources people encounter during the course of those lessons. Students like learning about historical practice, not how to code. Yeah, we don't really do that. We often say why the tool, not why the method. Why Booker, for example? Now, I'm not saying that's a problem. Maybe this isn't our place to do so. But we're sort of, like Rob was talking about, we're not really talking about the rules of the game here in terms of method. We're sort of just saying, here's a tool. We're not saying why visualize and how you might go about visualizing. Students dislike titles that are very maths and stats heavy. We maybe do that. Here's a few examples of titles, including one that Justin might recognize. We very much have a kind of title set which is kind of tool plus output heavy. Using JavaScript to create maps of correspondence. Again, I'm not so sure if this is a problem. It may be a function of the different types of pedagogy, but it's just something I wanted to think about in terms of what our undergraduates don't like and what maybe our audiences of kind of postgraduate plus into being researcher people actually are looking for from something like program historian. Students have hugely varying skill levels. We certainly acknowledge that within the programming historian. We have difficulty levels. One of my constant questions, though, is the extent to which whether we are the right people to assign difficulty levels and how we create feedback loops. So when I'm in a classroom, I can feel from my students, right, whether I've said it a bit too high and I can kind of adapt down, or I can feel it's too easy and I can adapt up a little bit. We don't do that with a programming historian at all, and we don't really have those feedback loops to incorporate that. Again, different type of mode of pedagogy, but maybe something to think about. Handouts are your friend. We are one big handout. And the final two, you learn a lot about assumptions of colleagues and thinking about whether or not it sinks in. We certainly don't do that program. So this is sort of a horrible plug for the fact we're trying to build a financial base for the programming historian at the moment. But one of the reasons we're trying to do this is to learn more about our audiences and how they interact with us, why they kind of come to program historian, what they need from us, because at the moment we don't know if this stuff sinks in after people go away having used our lessons. So after this kind of rapid tour through my digital history pedagogy brain, I want to finish with 2 questions this all raises me about teaching and digital history. And there's a few that also came up before. So certainly about assessment, there's some interesting questions that came up. We don't do assessment undergraduate stuff. Whether this work is in public or not is really interesting. I think that came out earlier, but also that core versus optional stuff that came up is really interesting. But my 3 I had in advance were these. So the first is like, what is easy and what is hard? We often say it's easy to teach the basics and hard to teach progression, and that's quite generic in teaching tech. It's always easy to get people going, but not to carry on. But in both cases of the work that I'm doing, the basic is very different. One is about reflexive methods, really, and one is about practical methods. The thing I'm really teaching is not the practice in my undergraduate teaching, actually. It's kind of about how to reflect carefully on the methods. And the question for me then, is this a function of audience? They have very different audiences, this undergraduate research and the program historian, or is it a function of format in terms of class versus print, or is it kind of a combination of both? The second is about negativity and positivity. What is the right balance in the way we teach tech within history? Much of the undergraduate teaching I've described today is framed around problems with regards to historical practice. The problem of search, the problem of digitization, the problem of power. And we draw on a lot of post-colonial, queer and feminist literature to do this. Whilst programming historian is probably a little bit positivist. With X, you can do thing Y. And I'm interested in the fact that I do both those things simultaneously, and I've never actually, till I sat down to talk about this, joined those 2 things together. But, ooh, might do negative in one and 2 positive in the other. Where's the balance there? And the final is the classic one about investment. Where should the investment go? By paying Sharon and I to do this, and your university is paying your wages as well, ultimately our universities are placing a huge investment at undergraduate level, with outcomes including things like employability, which undoubtedly we've all got on our minds, but also kind of a differently skilled cohort of students for those percentage who go on to do postgraduate and those percentage that go on to that into further postgraduate and into being part of the profession more broadly. Program historian, on the other hand, has for over a decade not benefited from any direct investment, is only now trying to develop an income stream to do more kind of off-website work, so workshops, community building, etc. And there's need to really think, what are our priorities then as a subfield within history? What does it want to invest in, and why are we choosing the particular places we are doing so? And I will leave it there.
Do you want to slide a little over? I'm going to be the voice from the outside. Wait, I wasn't thinking back far, James. You'll be off camera as well. But we're opening up now, so thank you very much to our three panelists. Really quite diverse, really quite interesting. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for discussion. There is, as James quite nicely did, there's some crossover in the areas: assessment, public, law. Indeed, even easy hard, one of those things that he was thinking about, and also reflexive and practice. I think those are all very interesting. So I'm not going to speak anymore. I'm going to pass over to the floor, and we'll also see whether we've picked up anything online in terms of questions. So opening up to the floor and to yourselves. Any questions? Go ahead.
So is this? So one of the things that came through in your talks was kind of trying to balance the sense of realism, and part of the realism was on student expectations and student skills. So are you at the level that you're happy with in terms of pushing this forward, or are you are there things you can't yet do because you don't feel you have the skills, the resources,
Yeah, okay, I'll start. I think for the digital storytelling, I'm quite happy where it is at the moment, but it has been running, I think, for 6 years now. So, and each time it's refined and it's got better, and we've sorted out, various other things. And I think, I don't know if others are finding the same, but I'm also finding that students are coming in with a much higher base level than even 5 years ago. And I think it's also perhaps reflective of the type of cohort we attract, because we do a lot of creative things. We have very creative students who come to act in plays and sort of do these sorts of things. So in a sense, in terms of taking it forward, a lot of the students now, in a sense, go even beyond, as I say, beyond the technology I offer them. And so even last term, I had a student come up saying, do I have to use this, or can I just go and film things using a camera? Because she had all the skills. I was like, well, if you teach everyone else, sure. And she was like, thank God. And then left the room. I was like, all right, I'd like to see your video. So in a sense, that moves away from the concept of digital storytelling, because I want to take it to that next level. And so I do wonder to what extent in maybe another 5 years, this might be completely outdated, because maybe the base level will be much higher and they will laugh at me and my JPEGs. And yeah, no, just to pick up on things that students don't know. Yeah, the JPEG file and how to tell the DPI of an image is also something that, I find very few students sort of know.
I suppose I've kind of washed my hands with trying to make sure everyone's at the same level. I've largely given up on that. So I no longer set specific games for students to go out and look. So I've got a list of suggested ones. I always make sure there's a couple of games that are available, browser-based games, free-to-play games that students can download. They can use the university computers to play a lot of the time. And even if it's entirely possible to do the course without ever playing a game. It's tricky, but you can do it. So you just use Let's Plays, you use reviews, forums, and so forth. So I don't know, it's inadvertently kind of self-moderated. So if you've got the students who are very tech-savvy, who are very much into their games, they can go out and play these ridiculously complex things. They can mod stuff to their heart's content. But as was the case a few years ago, if I have a student who doesn't actually enjoy games and just took the module because they were interested in doing something different, then it can still facilitate that, which is a bit of a cheat, but it seems to be working currently.
I guess I'll address a bit the question that's kind of about, am I happy? There's a few, so one of the things that's made me happy over the last few years, because this was like presented to me and Sharon as there's this hour a week billet when we both arrived, and so it's taken us a while to kind of develop what we think really works. I think what's been really great is that we've managed to, other parts of the curriculum have started to sprinkle in parts of the kind of stuff that we're interested in. So either modules that we run where we sprinkle in a bit of the kind of the skill stuff, building on the skill stuff with actual tasks related to the modules. So like I teach my module on the history of the printed image, and the students might actually end up doing some like computational image analysis to think about how similar printed images might be. Sharon does a module on social networks and history, and that goes right up to thinking about really contemporary social networks and Usenet stuff. And so there has to be some engagement with materiality of the digital release there. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of like, there's a bit of kind of, we've started having discussions about whether we want to have sort of kind of optional course and kind of optionality thing that's around sort of like a place in our curriculum where we can say, well, a bunch of students can go here if they want to do like paleography, and a bunch of students can go this one if they want to do like oral history, and a bunch of students go here if they want to do like programming stuff, right? And like specific skills in the profession, and maybe we have a block there for that. That's not got anywhere yet, but that's a discussion we started to have. And I think where I'm less happy is thinking about the stuff to do with when you mention research leave. It's like succession planning. At the moment, this kind of stuff is very heavily reliant on a few people actually keeping this going. And the reason it's not running this year is to do with reasons to do with Sharon and I and our kind of contractual status, which is a relatively public known thing, which meant that we weren't actually planned into this year's teaching. And so this year's teaching kind of changed a bit in terms of the skills for our current first year undergrads because of just at the time it meant we couldn't commit to as much stuff as we originally wanted to, right? So there is an issue around we all want to keep this going and we think this is a valuable part of our curriculum, but it doesn't necessarily, it can't always be me, it can't always be Sharon running this across a whole academic year. So there's a kind of succession planning issues there, which I find they're hard to deal with, but they're things that are just interesting when you have like parts of curriculum that are seemingly performing a function that departmental wide everyone agrees should be done. And that can be the case of anything, right? But when only certain people have the skills to deliver it.
So I suppose I'm in a bit more of an advantageous position, well, from an institutional standpoint, the modules are run using computer games, they're optional. So if I disappear, then they just replace the module or find someone who's interested in running this. And I suppose I'm happy. I have the skills necessary to run the course as I'm doing it now. I'd like to be better at coding, at programming, well, basically I need to take Claire's course.
Yeah, I think in terms of succession, just to sort of pick up on that, like, yeah, and once it becomes a form of assessment in a compulsory module, it really is succession planning becomes a big issue because, yeah.
Tessa, I think another question, and then have you got a question here as well? Yeah, Tessa.
So I have a question initially, perhaps for James, but maybe the others could also then add to that. So you were saying that you run sort of the What is Digital History lecture as the last one in your lecture series, because you said you don't want to do it in the beginning. Does it have to do with the fact that if you start with a theoretical discussion about what is digital history, that's kind of too much for the students? Or, and you think it's better to build it from the ground up, to start them with practical stuff? Or you don't want to problematize it in the beginning? So what's the reasoning behind that? And maybe also for the others more generally, so how do you kind of theorize digital history, what it is, and so on, the methods explicitly? Or do you do it more sort of introduce it simply in more practical terms that the students learn about this as they go along? Or do you kind of spend a certain amount of time also on theorizing that on a kind of grander scale?
I have three answers, one of which is like, because I read someone else's answer, one of which is the proper, like, fully intellectual answer, and one of which is the sort of panic answer. So the panic answer basically was, we started doing that as the first one and they all looked at us blankly. the reading other people answer is that Ryan Cordell, I think it is, has a piece that's on why not to say what is digital humanities in the context of what is digital humanities, and I kind of just reapplied that.
Mhm.
And the third is to do with, I think, and this is the one I think does work, but that we maybe came to latterly, is kind of, it enables you to kind of at the end go, you can do this now.
Okay.
And like, not to start with that, but kind of get to the end, having gone through some stuff and saying, hey, you can probably like emulate what some of these people are doing, because actually what they're doing is actually not that super hard. And that also fits with, like, I mean, I do some work with the Carpentries who run software training for scientists and things, and they have a very strong pedagogical ethos on not starting out with like, you'll be able to do this at the end of the day. They think that's a really bad pedagogical tool. They think it's much better to kind of not overinflate ambitions at the start, even if that is what you're going to get to. But it actually works better if you gradually build people's skill set and then ask them to reflect on, like, what did you learn? Like, what do you now know you didn't know? And that they reckon that's a much better way of kind of delivering satisfaction from pedagogy than like, this is your end state. So yeah, 3 answers.
For me, I don't call it digital history at all. I just say it's history. And I think I had a colleague actually in the history department at Warwick who ran, I think it was called Making Digital History or something, as a sort of optional module, and got very few enrollments actually. Because I think, I was like, oh no, it had the word, it looks like an amazing course, but it had the word digital in it probably. Whereas for me, all the stuff that I do, it's not its own module. Like, there's a lot of traditional stuff they learn as well, but for each module I teach, there's 1 or 2 seminars or lectures where we're in a computer lab. And it's like just presented as, and now we're going to do this aspect of this particular module. So I never ever label it digital. It's just, and I think that's correct. It is just history at this point in time, right? Like, I mean, we're all using computers. We're all using these sorts of modeling systems and things like that.
Yeah, very much the same. I don't think I say the word digital or the phrase digital history at all over the course of the work. Occasionally digital games, because computer games is a mouthful. But I don't know, in terms of the theory though, we do we have 2 weeks at the start of the semester dealing with, well, first of all, the concepts of historical accuracy and authenticity within games, and what that actually means, and why that's not really the most interesting thing to be talking about. And then we have another week where we look at the nature of games, how they can represent history. Thinking about, I should really do more to tie this in with, digital history more generally. And that's definitely something I'll be taking away from this, but that's a front load the theory. I don't ask the students to come back at the end of the module, and I think it's something else that's worth adding, and thinking about, why computer games for history.
I mean, I think, in terms of this reflexive thing, I don't necessarily ask students that either, but what often happens is when they're all applying for jobs in their 3rd year, and I was like, well, you could say you'd have all these digital humanities schools, and they're like, oh, that was digital humanities? Oh, and then they write it down. So, so at that point, they're like, oh, I have skills.
So I'm trying to make this a coherent question, but I was just wondering whether your institutions have been setting up any interdisciplinary courses, and how you'd feel if the modules that you've been talking about were offered to non-historians. I know, Rob, in your presentation, you were talking about how you'd be interested in collaborating with video game courses, or I'm quite interested in almost. I know several institutions have been setting up interdisciplinary master's courses and undergrad courses, but do you think there's opportunity here for the modules that you've been talking about to be kind of opened up to non-historians if there was kind of scope?
I'll start. Our university, Warwick has something called the Institute of Advanced Teaching and Learning, which runs interdisciplinary modules. And we also have a new liberal arts program, which is by conception interdisciplinary. And I think it would be fabulous, it would be my answer, but there is an institutional issue, which is that how to account for people's time. So I have been asked to teach on interdisciplinary modules, but I'm not bought out from my department. So in a sense, it's like the goodwill on top of
So it's
my
an internal
teaching load.
politics and budget issue.
Yeah, exactly. So I've just said, look, it's lovely, but I feasibly, until we come up with some system where it's allocated on a broader level, which is horrible, but this is the world that we live in. That has been a big sort of, it's sort of,
I think this is very much the case.
Oh, it makes me feel better then. It's not just.
Even the best will in the world from both departments and indeed the institution is Winchester is keen to do more interdisciplinary things. It's just the practicalities, arranging hours, sorting out what happens if computer design doesn't go on research leave, what happens then, who takes it over. In a way, it's easier for me because it's just a single module, so that can slot in a bit more easily. But at the same time, it's harder because what's the point in going through all this rigmarole? How do you use that word? Well, going through all this rigmarole in order to run a single module. I'm sad to say I'm not qualified enough to run to create enough modules to create a course that's digital humanities or even history and computer games, which would be brilliant. But I don't know how exactly you'd be able to do that.
I think we would encounter the same institutional pressures. But I also, there's two things I want to say to that. So one is, for 2 years we've done this with the art history students as well, because we're in the same school, so we can deliver it to both of them. It's not happening this year because of.
Do they do it at the same time? So do the students?
Yep, they're in the same lecture theatre at the same time, and we use the word art history. When we say historians, we also say art historians, and we bring in more examples that fit with what they're doing. The challenge there is that temporally they're about the same for the first term, and then the second term the historians get to like 1900 and the art historians are going up to 1970, so we suddenly our examples of sources start breaking down. And I think that's why I'm actually I like doing it with the art historians and want to continue doing that, but I also think there is value sometimes in sticking to a disciplinary line, because you've got a bunch of people who are, broadly speaking, apart from joint honours, which there's loads of them at most institutions these days, including ours, broadly speaking, doing a degree subject. They have a a lane in which they're sticking in, and you can hit that lane, and you can say to them, right, you're doing history, therefore this is relevant to historians. And we do at Sussex, for example, have modules which we call electives, where our first and second year students do have elective modules, where in theory you can take a elective module from any department of the university, as long as you've got the basic prerequisite skills. And so students do have an experience of being in rooms where they are totally interdisciplinary. And in theory, we could run some of this as part of the elective program offered by our department. But I do wonder what I would offer that would be history enough, whilst also doing some digital things that wouldn't run into the problems of actually them not having the same back knowledge or back thinking, or the other modules I know that they are in because they are history students, right? That means I lean on, you're doing this stuff here in historical controversies, and it's but I know they're doing it, right?
Yeah,
I know they're thinking about, say, the fact that historians disagree with each other, and there are reasons for it. Whilst if I was doing that in a room with people that weren't doing historical training, they might not have come across that concept before. And so it's easier because I know they should have some tacit knowledge, and just by being around the history part.
It's the problem of having different learning outcomes for different people in the class and potentially different assignments and so forth.
And also, I want to teach history. I don't want to teach a bunch of random stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so much familiar in everything all of you have said. I guess my own experience is closest to yours, Claire, in terms of I use story maps.
Oh, yeah.
Do a similar kind of thing. But the question I want to ask is about assessment. So you mentioned using teamwork and assessing that, which is kind of one thing. But I'm more confused about James's sort of indirect assessment. But especially whether you see this kind of thing becoming harder to achieve or getting harder to teach as students seem to be getting a slightly more instrumental approach to their degrees. Because you've been painting what sounds like a very positive picture of intellectually stretching students and seeing the rewards gently piling up later in the degree, which is great and how we all love degrees to be. But I'm increasingly in the last few years finding students who are for one, very anxious about whether they are prepared to complete the particular task we're making them do, because they're more concerned about the grades in that respect. Also, just having a very, where's the benefit for this? So I've had, in some respects, students voting with their feet if they don't see a direct correlation between what's being taught in the seminar and the assessments that they're going to do. We don't have much in the way of attendance rules at Essex, so they vote with their feet. And I've had direct complaints. These are bad seminars because this seminar does not directly lead to the learning outcome of an assessment, so why are you making us do it? Bit of a spiel, but I'd be interested, especially how you make assessment work.
Okay, so in the first year stuff, it's not assessed, and I would say that it's indirect because you don't directly assess students on having been to the lecture that's on referencing, but you do. So like basically, it would be if they're using primary sources badly because they happen to have found a digital version of it, then they're being indirectly assessed because they're like, well, we know you've done some stuff around this. So that's kind of where that comes from. On instrumentality, yeah, I mean, students do vote with their feet, and we've ended up in this interesting trend where we tend to over the previous years we've been running it, it starts off quite well attendance, then it drops a bit, but you get this core group always come. And I think that's quite interesting. The core group who come every week. It's like, oh, you just recognise all the faces of about the you've lost maybe sort of half or something, but they're still coming. But I think more broadly on the assessment thing is, so one of the things I think we're really lucky, Sharon and I, have fallen into with the Sussex History Department is that there's a lot of assessments. So the way our arrays work across the degree is that a chunk of modules will always have this same type of assessments attached to them. So if it's like spring of the second year and you're doing a time and place module, you always write a 3,000-word assessed essay. There are other arrays where we have reflexive essays. And what we're really lucky about, I guess, is that reflexive essays are something the students are used to. And so our module we were running on history of the archive, we ended up using a big chunk of the module where the students basically were archivists for about 5 weeks. And they had an archive that we had, and they went through processes of working with it, thinking about how cataloguing data is produced, digitizing it, etc. And then wrote a reflexive essay on having done that. And we're really lucky that we have that as a kind of thing that our students are really used to doing, even if they don't all love it, they're kind of used to doing it. And so it's part of our mixed methods of assessment. So if we get it right where the modules end up in the module arrays, we can use things like reflexive essays as ways of sort of getting this stuff more at the front and center, when otherwise it should quite rightly, I think, be about historical stuff we want them to learn as much as some of the underlying skill stuff. So I think that's where we're there. But yeah, I mean, the assessment stuff is complicated in relation to learning outcomes. But we usually try and think of it in terms of how we would more broadly assess their competence as a historian. That this stuff is mostly about their competence as historians.
I think I would just like to clarify. So the way that we operate is we make them do group digital stories in the first term and have the Hellies. And then in the second term, if they choose it for form of assessment, it is by themselves because although if you're interested in group assessment, the theatre studies department at Warwick has some wondrous things about how to assess group work because they all have to do performances together. And there's some very interesting, it's very finely thought out. So there is, but in classics, we just thought it's one step too far. And in terms of the motivation, I think it's kind of awful, but the use peer pressure to great effect because they are working in groups. If you don't turn up, it's not just me. I don't mind if you turn up to a seminar or not, but you're laying down your group, and quite often they work together. Then in friendship groups, and then the idea of that being like the Hellies, and like I do print a program and everything, and it's an event, and then you're not in the program if you don't complete the work. I mean, I'm kind of devilishly evil in that sense, but also what I do. Not every year, but I quite often have a question on the final exam about digital storytelling, saying, to what extent is this an appropriate medium for communicating the Hellenistic world, which is a reflexive piece. Having done the work, what worked, what didn't, what were the, things, and we get some very good responses to that. And students, because the type of student that you're talking about will have checked the past exams, of course, won't they? And they'll see that I have a question on there, and then they think, oh, okay, it's going to be on the exam in a sense, or like it might be. So I'm going to see and I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to think about it, which is sort of horrible that you have to sort of do it in that way. But then also the thought that in the first term that they could this is a form of assessment I'm teaching you. Sort of makes them motivated to learn the skills. Yeah.
I should say, it's a very quick one, because you reminded me that we do often say the Making Modern World, for example, does often have an exam question that's along the lines of things to do with, like, how does everything that's been digitized relate to the reality of the Making Modern World, stuff like that. So there is, like, that we often do have a question there as well. Not that many take the question necessarily, but that's again self-selecting. But we do have some of that.
So this is an add-on lecture that can sort of sits.
They are in the modules. So the module has,
You
each
run
of these
the-
modules has
the physical
has
sessions.
3 lectures and 1 seminar, and one of those lectures is me or Sharon or Tim.
But that's, you said physically in the same room, you have people from art history as well as history.
That's because we
Such clever
did some
timetabling.
timetabling cleverness to mean that 2 sets of students are in the same room, and timetabling would like us doing that. But yeah, try to. We end up just taking the biggest lecture.
So the first year is either on the early modern world or Making Modern World.
Oh no, sorry. One in the autumn, one is in the spring. So they're running. They're there all year long with us. They run through those 2 modules.
Any other questions?
Can anyone go to the Hellies? Is it open?
Oh,
Is
Oh yeah, it is. I can tell you when the next Hellies is.
So if anyone's near Warwick University, they can go
Yeah,
to the Hellies.
the
It
next
sounds fantastic.
Hellies is at 6:30 p.m. on the 17th of February. Our celebrity judges have been appointed. Wine reception to follow.
Sounds amazing.
Can I ask you about that? Because there's something that really interests me, which is that relationship to doing stuff in public. So I've just started so talk about sprinkling. I've just started sprinkling into our second year art history stuff. They go to Rome basically every year as part of their course. And with the art history department, I've worked with them to build a site where the students can sort of deposit photos of things they take in Rome and think about the relationship between art and the city, which is what they're thinking about in that module. And the idea is that they're trying to take a picture of a thing and turn it into structured representation like an art curator would, right? And that's the first thing I've done in public. Everything else has been kind of, they're only ever doing stuff submitting to us. And there is that real interesting dynamic with undergraduates where they know only like 1 or 2 people that are going to read it compared to when they think it's going to be publicly available. I just want to know about how your students feel about that, because there's a real difference between writing an essay and putting something on YouTube. And I don't really care whether or not your university's freaking out about it. But I'm interested in the students, how they feel about doing public work, because it's so common in the US, and digital pedagogy in the US is always like public. We don't actually do much of it.
I've got a good example if I'm allowed, because I've been helping teach a module here at UCL for the interdisciplinary BASC, and one of the bits of coursework is the students have to make a meme using open source cultural heritage collections, but we make the students share the meme that they've made for their coursework with the world, and they've got to talk about their decisions of where they share it and how they promote it and what audience they've made it for, or who they think would get the humour if they've made it humorous. But again, some of them were really wanting to share their work, and some of them are not comfortable with it at all. And again, I was wondering how common it was for inviting students to share their work publicly.
I mean, I think it comes back to sort of the departmental environment, that we do a lot of outreach events with schools and museums, and one year we staged a Roman funeral on Halloween at the Ashmolean Museum. I mean, so it is embedded. We run something called the Warwick Classics Network, which is about bringing classics into like the schools and the broader public. So, and the students are trained to go out to schools and do this in addition to their studies. So in a sense, since the moment they arrive, and every year we put on a professional performance of an ancient play and invite hundreds of school children, and at the Warwick Arts Centre. So there is, in the degree, and they see, like, you know, we have Michael Scott in the department, he's constantly on the BBC, you know, so it's part of the part of the course in a sense. The public thing is interesting too, so I don't actually put up all the videos because I do check them, of course, before they go up, and some will not don't meet copyright requirements. But then for the students, I say, look, for you, you can put it on your CV. You know, it's a thing that you have ownership of, and I think that brings a certain level of pride. Same as the Wikipedia stuff. So lovely. They were so nervous about editing Wikipedia. Like, so what I write now, like, that's it. I got to get it right. And I was like, well, someone can come along and reject your changes, but sure, you know, think about it this way. And then when they saw it, they're published, like, wow. You know, and the interesting thing with the YouTube stuff is having everything up there. And, you know, I showed you a nice digital story, but there are varying levels, let's say. But it also means that when students come to do the assessment, they have all the previous stories there. And so I say to them, what's working, what's not working, what was really good, what was not good, what was really weird. Like there was one really good story one year, but then there was a picture of a cat in the middle. It was a little strange, just disjointed, like, you know, so they can go and look at that archive. And the assessed stuff we do put up as well. If we ask for the assessed stuff, we ask the students' permission. If they're happy, we put it up after the exam boards. And that way, students who are doing the assessment this year, it's happening this term. I say, okay, this story, and this story got firsts. That's, you know, and then look at the other ones though, so you don't make the mistakes that they made. So it actually provides them a nice learning tool as well.
You're building a library of the videos.
Yeah, and like the student, and so we do use it in outreach and engagement events as well. We have like family day where like the local community can come onto campus. And we always run like a room of activities, and one activity is we have a computer going and all the stories are there. And click on the videos. And because the students see us doing it as well, it's not just students and their staff are also making videos. They see it as historical practice then, and not just some random thing I'm getting them to do.
It's a brilliant
You're not saying that your students are going to game fairs and trying to sell their board games. They can make a lot of money out of that.
It comes back to the different types of assessments. There's a module that I would love to run. So it's a group project. We produce something at the end of it and have the students produce a board game, but we get very little uptake because it's so dramatically different. To be fair, I suspect it's some of the, if any of you have been involved in like volunteering or placement modules, that these are brilliant opportunities, but students tend to shy away from them because it's a bit unknown. It's not the same sort of assessment assignment as they have elsewhere. I would love to have students release them up, but then I just get onto the Steam mod forums.
Actually, practical point, actually, topically. If you're running a module that's just got traditional exam and essays and there's a strike, you can just take that question out of the exam paper, or students just don't choose that week's topic. If you've got a module where certain weeks are doing digital tasks and learning outcomes assessments depend on doing those things, I found an awful lot more of a problem. More discontent about strike.
Actually, that's true. It's never conflicted, actually. And now I think about it, it's some sort of miracle that I've managed to escape this. Because I couldn't even, like, do it in a lecture. Like, when I do go back to lecture, I can't then just teach the practicals. We won't have the lab.
We are not the only part of the university doing cumulative practicals. I think I need to spend more time talking to my colleagues in other departments where this kind of practice is more normal, irrespective of whether it's a context of strikes. Where it's in the context of like, how do you manage multi-week stuff? How do you manage group projects? And we could all probably do better talking to those people because they could be ill for 2 weeks, right? You know, and how does that affect a cumulative project in that way? And how does that create stress for an educator?
I think we've got time for one last question. I can leave in case anyone. No.
I had a question.
I'll come back to you.
Okay.
I'll give you a last kind of say round.
Can I talk about maths, stats, and coding? So that came up. And students' attitudes to it not being positive, which makes me sad. But I understand it. So I think maybe it's a question mainly for James. But I think maybe there's probability and game theory in your work, and maybe some maths in your work too, Claire. But how do you address that? Do you bin it, hide it, do something else, and what's worked?
There is a part of the first year, one of the lectures, in which I introduced the idea that something happened to history in the 80s and 90s where we got less interested in things like economic history, but no, there's a classic one, right? Like In Pursuit of History, you used to have a whole chapter on basic stats and code and maths, and now there's a paragraph, I think, in the 7th edition or something. So basically, there's a narrative of historians moving away from that as part of the core of their practice, and that's just what it is. And I guess I try and reflect on that in the sense of that happened just at the moment we probably needed their skills. So it's to say, I understand that your vision of historian is not someone necessarily does massive demographic work, because you probably know that most of them don't use statistical approaches or use code or use maths. But there are a small number who do. Some of them are part of more traditional quantitative work that's been going and still thriving since the kind of the mid 20th century, and others is kind of more newer, different stuff. And then there's a second year, we have a module that's about kind of our historiography module in the second year, and that addresses that at greater length, thinking about that historical change. So I guess we just try and frame it and say, we know. I also have the beginning of the lecture where I ask students to stand up or to demonstrate whether or not they did like maths at GCSE, and then whether they did well at maths at GCSE, and whether they did the equivalent at something like A-level, until basically we end up, and then the last question is, does anyone in the room know how the algorithm works on Google search? And by the time we get anywhere near the end, everyone sat down. So this is more a kind of sense of like, look around yourselves, and everyone who's come to university and does history doesn't really do maths, stats, and coding stuff. I did maths at A-level, weirdly. Doesn't mean we're any good at it, but I think it's just a thing. The way the UK education system streams students is to away from that kind of stuff, and it means they don't have that kind of basis or interest, and maybe that is why we get some of those comments that are less favourable. So we just try and shy away from it a little bit, and then when needs be, say maybe you need a little bit now.
Because you mentioned you took it off the titles, but is it still in some of the content?
Yeah. But in different ways.
Hiding vegetables.
I don't have a module called digital history, but I hide stuff in modules, right?
So I'll give Claire wanted to say something, and then I'll obviously give equal opportunity to Rob and James.
Oh no, I just wanted to ask Rob a question. I mean, in terms of funding, I've often toyed with the idea of asking the software companies to provide the software for free, and I know several people who have successfully done this for digital history initiatives. So a colleague of mine adopted digital storytelling in Australia, and they got Adobe Creative Suite to just sponsor the whole thing. And then suddenly the university paid attention because all this money was coming in. And I thought, my goodness, I mean, yeah, show me how it's done. And I have, there's
an exclusivity that then the students only had to use that product and not anything else. Is that sorry to
no, I was just
I was
curious.
part of the Crytek kind of project, but the students could only use the Cry engine and not anything else, and that was kind of fine. But I'm just thinking, does it then tie you into a kind of theirs is the one true software, and nothing else exists?
And then what I think they negotiated was, because then when the students graduate, they no longer have access to that software. But there's Matthew Nichols at Reading who does, and he's like SketchUp, which is the architectural modeling software. He's an ambassador or something, and he came and did a seminar for us, and like SketchUp just sent all the software.
He's more or less completely recreated what late imperial.
Yeah, and it's now being turned into a game. And the great thing is, all the Roman historians are just getting lost in the suburbs of Rome, and we can't get out.
And he did a seminar. He did a paper digital history seminar about 3 years ago.
Oh, there you
So if you want to revisit it, go.
Yeah.
It is. Sorry, his name is again.
Matthew Nichols at the University of Reading.
Well, this is the thing. I've approached a few companies about this, and there's some interest in supplying games. We've managed, because it's not as big a software suite. Most of the games that I'm asking about are decades, if not old. So there's some potential there. There's often tricky riders attached to it, so they must only be installed on the following machines and so forth. No one said you must only use our games, which has been a bit of a relief. And it just ended up, because for various practical reasons, no, but I can see how it could potentially work if I tweaked it a bit. I don't think I'm going to get a large sack of money for doing this, but I will keep informed.
One last word from anyone on the panel. Otherwise, I think we've worked the panel very, very hard and given us a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion and thinking about digital history in the classroom. And I hope you've come away feeling empowered, reflexive, and engaged. Thank you very much, and let's give all the panelists a final applause. And just to end, I should say we are meeting again in 2 weeks' time for our next seminar, which is going to be on the Living with the Machines project from the Turing Institute. Maps of machines using computer views to analyze geography of the Industrial Revolution. In this room, on Tuesday, the 18th of February. I hope to see you all here for that. Thank you very much. And I should last but not least, if you'd like to join us for a drink in the pub, please stick around and join.